Greetings, Jolly Scholar 888 here. After a bit of a hiatus, I admit, but if you can see my new environment, not that all my videos will be done here, but this is it's my RV. It's called the Champagne Lady, and there's a long story behind it. And at some point, when I'm on the road, we'll talk more about it. Right now, I am shooting this video from inside the Champagne Lady, and I've had to do a whole lot of rearranging of my living circumstances because those last videos I was continuously having to start them at like 2 in the morning, and things just kind of got out of hand. At any rate, the name of the series that I'm going to be doing right now is called Into the Forest, the Satyr Procession. It's my prelude to an introduction to techno-anarchism, believe it or not. And part 1 is the First Great Awakening. Now, why the First Great Awakening? What would that have to do with Nietzsche? Hold on. Let's hold those thoughts because hopefully it will become apparent. Okay, so the Great Awakening, somewhere between 1730 and 1755 in colonial America, or New England. Okay, so I want to start off with this little vignette that I think you're going to find very peculiar. So here goes. On March 7th, 1743, James Davenport, one of the most influential leaders of the Great Awakening, removed his pants and cast them into a bonfire. He called on his followers, gathered on a wharf in New London, Connecticut, to do the same to all their fancy clothes. The day before, the crowd had burned a pile of books by a variety of Christian authors. Now, of course, these were all Christians, right? Certain Christian authors. And on this day, some in the audience complied with Davenport's exhortations to burn their clothes. Soon a lofty pile of hoops and blah, blah, blah. And, they use the word for propriety at the end. In other words, a pile of their propriety. One particularly bold woman snatched Davenport's pants from the flames and threw them into his face, telling him to come to his senses. This act broke Davenport's spell over the audience, who realized that their faith had been transformed into frenzied chaos. The crowd dispersed, and a contrite Davenport realized he had gone too far. Interesting, isn't it? It's kind of hard to imagine our colonial forefathers doing this kind of thing. But there's more. At any rate, James Davenport had become among the most successful preachers in New England. But did the bonfire incident, as well as his previous arrest for sedition and slander, mean that the revivals were fundamentally flawed? Were the revivals a legitimate work of God, hampered only by unfortunate outbreaks of overheated frenzy, or what critics called religious enthusiasm? Or did Davenport and others like him pioneer a kind of spiritual democracy as he routinely led crowds of poor whites, African Americans, and Native Americans singing through the streets of colonial New England? Now, I've pointed this out in a lot of my work that anthropologists and historians of all kinds tend to ignore or just overlook music, even when it's right in their face. So I want to repeat this line. Or did Davenport and others like him pioneer a kind of spiritual democracy as he routinely led crowds of poor whites, African Americans, and Native Americans singing through the streets of colonial New England? Now notice the writer doesn't say singing what? What songs? In the literature, in that book, they don't make any references to it. However, we will get there. So let's look at some prominent leaders of the Great Awakening, just a couple. Okay, so Jonathan Edwards. The revival that historians usually view as the start of the Great Awakening began in Jonathan Edwards' Northampton Church in 1734. The most famous sermon preached during the Great Awakening, for example, was Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, delivered by Jonathan Edwards at Enfield, Connecticut in July 1741. Many in the congregation were affected by Edwards' sermon, with Minister Stephen Williams reporting amazing shrieks and cries caused by the highest religious excitement. Now, notice that there's a distinction between Jonathan Edwards and the minister, Stephen Williams. This would be compared. Stephen Williams was actually the minister of the congregation. Edwards, like many of the Great Awakening teachers, was itinerant. They would travel from place to place. So let's take a look now at George Whitefield. Edwards was not the most important evangelical leader at that time. That role fell to the Anglican priest and itinerant preacher George Whitefield, whose extensive travels across the North Atlantic world, that means back and forth between England, Wales, Scotland, and New England, celebrated ministry would make him the most famous person in Britain and the colonies, save for perhaps the king. Whitefield, a former stage actor, had been converted at Oxford University in 1735, that is, converted to evangelicism, partly through the influence of future Methodist leaders John and Charles Wesley. Those of you who are familiar with Methodism, those two names are very well known to you. After a mission trip to the new colony of Georgia in 1738, Whitefield returned to England and pioneered his most innovative preaching tactic, the outdoor meeting. In the churches, he was restrained by limited seating capacity and denominational traditions, but in the fields, he could gather as large an audience as possible and focus exclusively on preaching the necessity of the new birth, what we call born again. In England, Wales, Whitefield spoke before gargantuan crowds and became a media star. Now, limited seating capacity, but also denominational traditions. This will become important when we see how seating arrangements were by class within the churches. So right away, this starts to break down, right, when you all come outside. So Whitefield's colleagues from Oxford, John and Charles Wesley, founded the Methodist movement and brought dramatic changes to many Anglican churches, right? All of these people are still members of the Anglican Church, the Church of England, of which King George was the head. He was the head of the church, and he was also obviously the king of the country, but he was also the head of the church. And critics reminded evangelicals that frenzied emotions in a revival meeting could not substitute for a lifelong commitment to service and devotion to Christ and the church. And this would include an educated, well-studied clergy as guides. This becomes very important. The revival was marked by some exotic spiritual phenomena and behavior, such as divine visions and uproarious laughter during services. It's kind of interesting. Throughout the records of the Great Awakening, particularly in New England, one finds regular references to believers experiencing divine dreams, visions, spirit journeys, and trances. Spirit journeys, that's very surprising. Going to visit hell and heaven and things like that. It's kind of like Dante's Inferno, except a person actually experiencing it. Sometimes the Spirit chose the most marginal members of society to visit. In December 13th, for instance, an admittedly illiterate correspondent to Connecticut Minister Eleazar Whitlock described an incredible journey through heaven and hell. Many reported experiencing such visits to heaven where angels or Jesus himself showed them whether their name was written in the book of life. Others encountered the devil and witnessed the torments of the damned in hell. If the Holy Spirit lived in all believers, and if such phenomena occurred in the New Testament, why couldn't ordinary Christians experience these things too? Moreover, if lay Christians received such visitations from God and their pastors did not, who was more spiritually lively and sensitive? It's a good question, right? If the pastor has not experienced these ecstatic visions and this born again of the Spirit, then why were they learning from him? Maybe he should be learning from them. These kinds of issues raise questions in the minds of some lay people about whether their pastors were truly converted. Lay people during the Great Awakening demonstrated an amazing capacity to read, interpret, and apply the scriptures for themselves, sometimes in direct opposition to what their pastors told them. One of the best examples of such lay initiative was the case of Mercy Wheeler, a woman from Plainfield, Connecticut, who had been unable to walk for years. Protestants had conventionally taught that miracles of healing had ceased shortly after the founding era of the ancient Christian church. But Wheeler noticed in the gospel accounts that Jesus healed people regularly through his earthly ministry. Shocked critics said that such phenomena could not be expected and that spiritual healing was vastly more important than physical healing. Hostile newspaper commentators even suggested that the miracle was a fake. But according to follow-up reports, Wheeler, who had become a minor star in the evangelical community, maintained her ability to walk from then on, for years to come. So, and all of this is documented, for what it's worth. So let's take a look now. What was the religious environment at the time of the Great Awakening? Well, we have, of course, the Church of England, the Anglican Church founded by Henry VIII, which in practice, with some changes, kind of a de-emphasis of Mary and others, but basically if you've been to an Anglican service and you're Catholic, it's very similar, almost indistinguishable. Well, the flag of England. Another important church was the Presbyterians. Many Scots-Irish Presbyterians who settled in colonial Pennsylvania and New Jersey in large numbers also focused on the experiential, emotional effects of religious practice. Many came prepared to recreate the so-called holy fairs of Scotland and Ulster. It's in Northern Ireland. These regional festivals centered on large-scale open-air celebrations of the Lord's Supper, the Christian sacrament of communion, and for a century stirred the souls of Scots-Irish believers. Now, the story of the Scots-Irish is so important to American history. I would advise any of you to look into that. And of course, it's very important to music. And by the way, when we did the Seeger series, most of that music was Scotch-Irish. The communion season was a fixed feature of Scottish and Scottish-Irish Presbyterian practice. William Tennent Sr. and his sons, especially Gilbert, would become the single most influential family in creating Middle Colonies revivalism. They moved to Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and studied in Neshaminy in 1726. Soon after his revival, William Tennent began training candidates for the ministry at the Log College Seminary. Now, this is important, the Log College Seminary. Its graduates helped spread tenement styles of evangelical preaching throughout the Middle Colonies and also in Virginia. Now, see, these colleges are going to be important because the established Anglican Church and these preliminary subsets of the church, all of them created what we now call our universities. So let's move on now to the Congregationalists. The Congregational tradition was brought to America in the 1620s and 1630s by the Puritans, a Calvinistic group within the Church of England that desired to purify it, the Church of England, of any remaining teachings and practices of the Roman Catholic Church. As part of their reforms, Puritans desired to replace the Church of England's episcopal polity, the rule of bishops, with another form of church government. Some English Puritans favored Presbyterian polity, that's ruled by assemblies or presbyters, usually their elders, as was utilized by the Church of Scotland. But those who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony organized their churches according to congregational polity ruled by members of the local church. Now you can see how this is already, this differentiation is starting here in America. I mean, it's accelerating. The very beginnings were in England, but here it really accelerates. The key point here is that the Puritans still consider themselves Anglicans or members of the Church of England. The second is that they did develop their own leadership hierarchy, which led the entire community, both civil and religious. There's no separation still of church and state, however. The first Congregational church organized in America was the First Parish Church in Plymouth, which was established in 1620 by separatist Puritans known as the Pilgrims. The colonists developed a system in which each community organized a gathered church of believers, i.e. only those who were thought to be among the elect and could give an account of a conversion experience were admitted as members. This is very different from the formal, learned bishop system, of which the clergy was promoted according to their learning. This, of course, they got from the Catholic Church. Every congregation was founded upon a church covenant, a written agreement signed by all members in which they agreed to uphold congregational principles, to be guided by sola scriptura, scripture, and their decision-making, and to submit to church discipline. The right of each congregation to elect its own officers and manage its own affairs was upheld. This is really breaking away. They were still under the sway of the greater Anglican Church, but in practice, they were already breaking away, but they were tolerated. Now, the Puritans created a society in which Congregationalism was the state church. Its ministers were supported by taxpayers, and only full church members could vote in elections. To ensure that Massachusetts had a supply of educated ministers Harvard University was founded in 1636. So, let's get to the crux of why, at least the first step towards why am I doing this series. The Great Awakening has change and resistance. During the Great Awakening, however, many came to believe that the most important credential for authoritative religious speaking was the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. Some radicals began to recognize common people as exhorters and lay preachers, and some of the most extreme groups, including evangelical Baptists, even ordained uneducated men. They didn't mean really uneducated like they couldn't read or write. They meant they weren't educated in the official colleges. Colonial women, Native Americans, and African Americans always had more limited access to public authority, even within the evangelical movement. But some converts, such as Samson Occom, a Mohegan Indian from Connecticut, I imagine he probably was not the last, did receive ordination and became celebrated preachers and missionaries. Likewise, John Marant, a free African American living in South Carolina, converted after a dramatic encounter with George Whitefield and became a Calvinist Methodist minister in England and Nova Scotia. The First Great Awakening hardly destroyed all social distinctions in or outside of the churches, but it continued the potential to weaken traditional American social hierarchies built on class, race, education, and gender. Many white male evangelicals welcomed these new exhorters as brothers and sisters in Christ. The evangelicals' strong emphasis on the empowering effects of the Holy Spirit in every believer tended to level social distinctions in the churches, in these new churches especially. Many non-evangelicals believed that the revivals could open the door to all kinds of excesses and heresies, fueled by the overheated emotions of individual congregants. Opponents of the revivals argued that Christianity thrived on order and structure, not chaos. Well, this is an old issue, isn't it? In July 1744, Davenport published a retraction. This is the fellow that took off his clothes and made the bonfire. A retraction claiming that he had been possessed by demonic spirits. According to the Boston Weekly Post, the Boston Weekly Post boy, 28 March 1743, Davenport had exhibited signs of physical distress along with his unorthodox behavior, symptoms that at the time would have been interpreted as evidence of demonic possession. So the Great Awakening was the greatest upheaval in the American colonies prior to the Revolutionary War. Overall, there were three main camps during the First Great Awakening. Moderate evangelicals who supported the revivals but were deeply concerned about restraining their excesses. Anti-revivalists who saw the revivals as all emotion and no substance and feared that they would break down the authority of the established ministers. And radical evangelicals who saw the Great Awakening as a new era of spiritual power, accompanied by signs, wonders, and spiritual authority for the common man and woman. The First Great Awakening, though fraught with disagreements, inaugurated the evangelical movement in American Christianity. Although the word evangelical is commonly used today, it is often not clear what the term means. So to use a simple definition, evangelicism is a kind of Protestant Christianity that strongly emphasizes the need for personal conversion or the new birth. Evangelicals believe that human sin is so offensive to God that it would earn everyone eternal damnation in hell if Jesus had not died on the cross to save the people from the punishment. To be saved, however, one must personally receive the forgiveness that Jesus offers. So you see, it's this personal conversion which has to be an experience, not just learned, but an experience. You don't just learn the doctrine and then believe in it. In the evangelical system, especially the more radical evangelicals, you had to experience it, and you had to show that you did. Although Christians have always emphasized the need for forgiveness through Christ, evangelicals put enormous weight on the individual's decision to accept what Jesus did to save them. This is the seminal event in one's life, the most important, in a sense, the only goal of evangelical preaching. So if nothing else, your takeaway should be that if you haven't been born again, you're not really a member of an evangelical church. You're not an evangelist, but you're also not even a member of the church. You must be born again. Despite their theistic roots, similarly, churches before the Great Awakening highly valued order and propriety. Services featured long, formal, and heavily doctrinal sermons read from the pulpit. No one spoke out of turn, and seating was organized by social rank. This is an important example how the religion or culture, based upon the varieties of the religious experience, generates institutions and not the other way around. This is the most glaring flaw that I talked about earlier in the Marxist Gramsci strategy of creating cultural hegemony. The idea that you can start with the institutions and move back into the people. The resistance to that is overpowering. We'll talk about that at a later date. It's one of the reasons that socialism cannot ever succeed. So what we're seeing here is, as this evangelical movement, this great awakening, proliferated, and these emotional ecstatic experiences, new schools and colleges came into being, new institutions, new denominations, new churches. Institutions followed, not the other way around. Itinerants and local pastors worked together to produce and nourish revivals, and often local pastors would cooperate together to lead revivals in neighboring parishes. The most famous sermon preached, this is the one called Sinners in the Hands of God, Enfield, Connecticut, and it was presided over by Stephen Williams, who was, in fact, the local pastor. Concerns over the revival led the Connecticut General Assembly to call a synod in 1741, which was the last congregational synod convened under state authority. The General Consociation consisted of both lay and clerical representatives from all the consociations, interesting word, in the colony. It ruled that itinerant ministers should preach in no parish except with the permission of the local pastor. In May 1742, the General Assembly passed legislation requiring ministers to receive permission to preach from the local pastor. Violation of the law would result in the loss of a minister's state-provided salary. Taxpayers were paying the salaries of the priests, the priesthood. Again, that's more of a Catholic term, the pastors. So if they violated this law, they might lose their salary. In 1743, the annual Massachusetts Ministerial Convention condemned, quote, the disorderly tumults and indecent behaviors, unquote, that occurred in many revival meetings. Charles Chauncey of Boston's First Church became the leader of the revival's opponents with the publication of his seasonable thoughts on the state of religion in New England, which attacked the enthusiasm and extravagant behaviors of revival meetings. Now, you can see with that incident with him taking off his clothes, the shrieks, the people screaming, the people going into states of ecstasy, they don't ever really, in any of the literature I've come across, refer to eroticism directly. But notice the disorderly tumults and indecent behavior. Now here's an interesting article by Cedric B. Counting, published at the University of Hawaii. Sex and Preaching and the Great Awakening. Now, the article really has almost no sex in it at all. It's about sex ratios within the Great Awakening. Really very little to do about actual sexuality. But this little quote that he found by Timothy Cutler is kind of intriguing. Our presses are forever teeming with books, and our women with bastards. That's pretty damn suggestive. But nonetheless, they don't go much beyond that in any of the original sources. Some fellow was claiming that, reading a paper before the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1891, the iconoclastic Brahmin suggested that the Great Awakening was a species of insanity to which young women and Negroes were particularly susceptible. The confessions of Negro servants seemed to him grotesque. Well, that's pretty fraught with interesting suggestions, don't you think? Now, in much of the revivalist literature, you do come across the word rapture. The rapture, which is it's one of the words translated from the Bible. I'm not sure what it would have been in Hebrew or Greek, but the word is related to rape and to communion, right? So it's that ecstatic feeling of communion, of being taken away, which is the real actual connotation, taken away, absconded with, or taken away and enraptured. So you can see how the eroticism is sort of woven in there without being very explicit, but we call it the rapture. While most New Lights stayed with the established congregational churches, these were still those in New England who embraced the radical wing of the awakening with its trances, visions, and shouting. When radical revivalists could not control their local churches, they separated from the state churches and formed new congregations. So you see what is going on here. They are breaking away from the Church of England. Officially, they're no longer movements within the greater Anglican constituency. They're actually breaking away. So who's the head of the Church of England? The king. So again, hold that thought. And also hold the thought about the eroticism. It will be more apparent. In fact, it will become kind of institutionalized in the Second Great Awakening. My guess is that, especially when they went further away from the towns, this first Great Awakening spilled out of the churches into a neighboring field, a field not too far from town. They weren't really going deeply into the forest because, after all, these towns were in fact already in the forest. I mean, remember, there's still good relationships with Native Americans and at times bad relationships with Native Americans. So it was a frontier. They could get very violent. Attacks could come at any time. So the idea of just going out in the middle of nowhere probably wasn't a smart idea. They were already pretty much in the forest. So what I mean by this term is, and this is Nietzsche's concept with the Satyr Procession, this is the Dionysian procession, that these processions would go through towns and cities in ancient Greece or Thrace, wherever you believe the actual practices derived from. And they would go from town to town, and people would get caught up in it and actually follow. They would follow the Dionysian procession into the forest. They would eventually end up, as you know, with the myth, they end up with a violent escapade of the women tearing the body of Dionysius. But these kinds of actual events, not the mythological one, but actual events, did take place. Not surprisingly, possibly to a lot, they were led by men, but women usually were, more women left the village than the males. Okay, that'd be a whole subject there, wouldn't it? And of course, Dionysius was the sole male surrounded by the Maenads, or Meneids. So keep this in mind that there's an erotic, in this first Great Awakening, the eroticism is either played down deliberately, maybe it wasn't there as much, but certainly it's hinted at. So, in an era most of the colonies supported one denomination, either Anglican or Congregationalist, as the official state religion, nothing could be more disturbing to the establishment than the prospect of church splits and the unauthorized founding of new congregations. Great Awakening strengthened many Americans' personal religious commitment, or the Great Awakening. It also badly damaged the established churches by offering a serious alternative to them. Ultimately, evangelical dissenters would lead the charge against all state support for churches. Some radicals began breaking away from the state churches, especially New England, and setting up unauthorized meetings. So no one better demonstrated the journey from radical evangelicism to separatism and finally to becoming a Baptist than the great Baptist leader Isaac Backus. Also, Isaac Backus had no college degree. Now, again, that doesn't mean he was uneducated. It just meant he didn't go to one of the colleges. So the Baptist, one of the great Baptist leader was Isaac Backus, and these people were the most radical. Okay. In 1764, Isaac Backus joined, it's a whole series of guys, John Brown, Nicholas Brown, William Ellery, and several others as an original fellow or trustee for the chartering of the college in the English colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. This is the original name for the college that we now know today as Brown University. So notice, Brown University, we're going to see later on, Rutgers, many of the Ivy Leagues were formed in the Second Great Awakening. Harvard was started by the Puritans. So this was the first, this is what we now call Brown University, the first Baptist school of higher learning. So you see how this is working out. Experientialism, the ecstatic experience, is generating these higher institutions of learning, not, again, the other way around. Baptists in Virginia also fought hard for disestablishment in cooperation with non-evangelicals such as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. These better-known political leaders based their appeal for religious freedom on principles derived from the Enlightenment, which tended to view organized religion as a foe of social progress. But the Baptists, such as Minister John Leland, were among the most ardent proponents of full religious liberty in Virginia and New England, and they argued that government involvement with religion only hurt the churches. So, the university degree pastors, right, that was the norm. State or colonial governments and the British Crown had a monopoly over Christian institutions and Christian thought. Nonetheless, Methodism is rising within the Anglican Church and the Calvinist Puritans. To understand the predestination of the Calvinists, it's not as simplistic as people have made it out to be, but again, that's something that's lots of literature on, and if you're curious, you can look it up. So we have the revival camps into the forest, though in this terms, like as I said, they were mostly in the fields. They simply burst out of the church structure. If you see the church as the structure, the social structure, the embodiment of the social structure, right? They even sat in the pews according to social rank. And this begins to leave the social structure and go in a destructured. The famous anthropologist Victor Turner, in his ritual cycle, which of course I owe a great deal to him, he called it structure and anti-structure. So we can see this already coming about in the Great Awakening. So Nietzsche's Into the Forest and the music of the music as the Dionysian art. Into the forest to encounter a deeper reality, precisely what the camp meetings of the evangelical Great Awakening movement was doing. Rather than Dionysus and the Maenads leading the processions into the forest, it was the born-again preachers, inspired by the Christian Holy Ghost or Holy Spirit, leading people beyond the confines of the church walls to the outdoors where the large crowds could gather and where the social structures were deconstructed. Right now we have not necessarily white males speaking. You have blacks, Native Americans, women, even children. And then they'll go back into the cities and actually through towns singing in procession through the streets. Now, we will do a lot of work in my series to come on this concept of dancing in the streets, processions in the streets, a huge part of European history that utterly neglected. I'm pretty shocked at how neglected it has been throughout the academy. Eventually, they began going in great numbers directly to camp meetings that were prepared and announced in advance. In other words, they didn't even go to church. They went straight to the camp meetings. Now we're going to look at the sacred harp singing tradition and its role in the Great Awakening. First of all, a few preliminary remarks. I like the name sacred harp, so I use it all the time, but that's not really what the tradition as a whole is called. Sacred harp is a specific collection of songs or tune books from the FASOLA or shape note singing tradition. There are many others, such as the Missouri Harmony and the Kentucky Harmony, and many others that have come and gone over the last 250 years. FASOLA, as you might have guessed, refers to the syllabic singing of the tones of a scale, as in do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. You know, Dora deer, a female deer, that song. Rather than the letter names. Why use the solfege system? That's another story, but it's way superior, in my opinion, to the ABC system. But I can't explain to people who don't understand even the rudiments of music theory how exactly the shape note sight singing system works. This is a lamentable condition that Western civilization has come to in this regard. As I point out in my Music and Humanities series, throughout the centuries, all civilizations have modeled their conceptualizations of the cosmos in musical terms. You've probably heard of the music of the spheres, which was the Western interpretation. No educated person, up until maybe around 60 years ago, didn't have a musical education. It was simply unheard of. You were not considered educated if you could not read and write music. All aristocrats of the past were expected to sing, dance well, and write poetry, as well as fight. As the quote goes, never give a sword to a man who can't dance. It's an old Gaelic saying. In view of this lamentable fact, I'm simply going to explain the shape note singing techniques in its broadest application. So here it is. Shape note notation is designed to simply make sight reading somewhat easier to learn. As you can see in the musical staff of lines and spaces here, all the notes are ovals or circles. They're filled in or they're not filled in. In the second staff, you can see that the musical notes are given shapes. By assigning certain scale degrees a specific shape, the sight reader can recognize the scale position easier without having to calculate the actual distance, or interval, to that scale degree. This method orients the visual more directly to the tonal center and to the ear of the singer. This works well because the music is largely what we call modal, so there's a more limited set of possible tones that will be sung. But there, my explanation has to end. Explaining what I mean by modal versus diatonic is well beyond the scope of this discussion. So simply put, shape note notation makes it easier to learn to sight read. Nonetheless, sight reading, just like reading words, is not easy, and so even with shape note notation, the student would require a good year or two to become proficient. The shape note tradition originated in the British Isles, especially among the Presbyterians and Methodists. However, in America, the tradition really proliferated and developed well beyond its origins. By far, most of the music we have today was written in America, and the tradition has since traveled back to Britain, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, as will be demonstrated shortly. For the best source on the history of the sacred harp tradition, I so highly recommend the documentary Awake, O My Soul, very appropriately titled. It tells the story of the past, but it also captures the sacred harp as a living, vibrant tradition. So how many people in the colonial era could read and write and sight read music? Obviously, the vast majority of the population could do both, and this may come as a surprise to many of you. But the colonies were dotted with small, privately owned printing presses, where political pamphlets, farming almanacs, speeches, news, and yes, shape note hymnals were published. The colonial population was extremely literate. Again, when we see the term uneducated used, it only means the majority of the population who are not educated in the formal universities of the time. This would include pastors as well as music teachers. Wherever there was theology, there was music. All educated pastors were expected to compose music and hymns as well as sermons. Consider the example of Charles Wesley, the younger brother of John Wesley, who was the founder of the Methodist Church. Charles Wesley, as part of his role as pastor in the Anglican Church, wrote 1,400 hymns. He didn't write that many actual tunes, but he did write that many sacred lyrics intended to be sung as hymns. So now we get to naming. The songs of the shape note tradition are not usually named with titles that refer to the lyrics. The vast majority are named by the tune with the lyrical content as a subname, if they're referred to at all. But some, like Bound for Canaan, do have an actual title that refers to the text, but those are rare. The tunes are most often named after the region from which they were thought to have originated, or a biblical reference, or even a geographical object. The tune, Idumea, which we will use for the performance practice example that follows shortly, takes its name from the Latinized version of the Hebrew word Edom, meaning red. Edom was a region south of the Dead Sea in what is today Jordan. It is also related to the biblical name Esau, the older brother of Isaac, who is said to have been covered in red hair. A hairy fellow. The lyrics to the well-known song Amazing Grace, for example, is called New Britain, but it was sung to many other melodies before. In this way, the same lyric or hymn might appear under one tune name in one harmony book and under another name in another harmony book. This is a very old European tradition that allows for many sets of lyrics to be sung to different tunes. So now we get to how was shape note singing actually taught? Shape note singing was taught by itinerant music teacher composers who were not trained within the academy, just as the Great Awakening preachers were more often than not graduates from the theological schools. These music teachers would live basically on the road and stay for short periods of time in different towns or parishes to give singing lessons to the congregations. Further on in this presentation, I will discuss one of the most famous of the original itinerant FASOLA teachers, William Billings. So this, the itinerant music teacher, is the first obvious parallel component between the Great Awakening and the sacred harp tradition. So let's observe a singing example. Okay, so we start off with a singing that happens to be in Ireland. Now, as we discussed earlier, the tradition, at least the FASOLA singing, did begin in the British Isles, Ireland, Scotland. However, it really developed in the colonies. And so now here we are years later, 2012, and there's an actual sacred harp convention. Now the sacred harp is completely colonial, but now it's come back to Ireland. So the tune is Idumea, which we've discussed earlier. 47B is the number. this is because you can find an Adumea, and I have found one, that melody with another set of lyrics. So I've already told you about the name. The composer is Isaac Watts. The hymn writer is Isaac Watts. Now he's interesting. He wrote this in 1719. This is right in the middle of the Great Awakening. And it's called Am I Born to Die? It's very provocative. It's very a beautiful hymn, really. He was a Christian minister, a theologian, a hymn writer. He wrote 750 hymns, and he was a logician. So this is one of the very highly educated of the ministers, which most of these high Anglican Presbyterian clerics were. They were extremely well educated. The tune composer was Ananias Davison. He wrote the tune, or he arranged a traditional tune. We're not sure. He published it in 1816, which would be around the Second Great Awakening, in the Kentucky Harmony. He was an entrepreneur, printer, and music teacher. Now, let's go on now to the 4 traditional squares. You're going to see this in a minute. Here we go. Now, as you can see before you, the conductors are in the center. Traditionally, that's kind of a square there, and then there's 4 squares, front, back, and each side, right? So facing the conductors are the tenors, typically, and that's usually the melody. That's the main melody. Behind them, behind the conductors, are the altos, baritones. To the left of the conductors is they call them the trebles, and we would call it probably the sopranos. And to their right, the bass. Now, notice that this configuration does not include an audience, right? They're singing for themselves. They're not singing for an audience. It's the experience, and the experience when you're standing in the center is really is very intense. So the center is an empty square. It can be filled by anybody. Anyone can conduct. As you can see, there's 2 conductors. Really, the lady on my right, at any rate, is the actual experienced conductor. The fellow on the left is a novice, and this happens a lot. A novice will come up for the first few times with somebody who's more experienced. Well, there's usually a table when you first come to a singing, and on that table is some kind of book or notebook that you can sign up, and you sign up the song that you want to do, basically. The conductor conducts and sings. The novice, in this case, follows along. So at the end of the first song, but before that, you will see that the caller, there'll be a person sort of like in an orchestra, the first violinist. That person will look over what we call the tecciatura, that is the range, and he'll see if he's familiar with the singing group, if he needs to bring it up or down. And anyways, he will give that la. The rest of the chorus will pass it around in the same way that the orchestra will make sure that they're all tuned to the 440. So you'll hear this right now. A lot of music. So usually they limit it to 2 verses. So she just called out 1 and 4. The first time they sing it through, they sing the solfege. They don't sing the words. So I moved it up to the second verse because the chorus is really warmed up there, and it really sounds nice. Of course, I think so. When the people are finished, in this case, these two are finished with their conducting their two verses, the caller will call out the next person's name, and then those people will come up, or that person will come up. And this will continue for 2 hours. After that, they'll take a break, and there's usually a potluck lunch, and they do a lot of socializing, and the food is great. Everyone I've been to, the food is really great. So it'll continue for 2 hours, 2 hours of socializing and lunch, and then 2 more hours of singing. And then they'll do announcements, and then that will be the end. Even without knowledge of music theory, the average person today can immediately hear that the shape note or sacred harp choruses don't sound anything like typical church or concert choirs we hear today. One reason is the full-throated, natural singing style. The voices sound very different from the singing style of the 18th century that was being taught in the high churches. The singing is full-throated, almost yelling. They are not singing to sound pretty, but to be inspired. It is a music of and by the people. The harmonies are also markedly different, and they reflect the old modal music that preceded the classical style. This older modal style uses parallel fifths and parallel fourths, something specifically avoided within the classical style, and the results are very pronounced. Again, those terms don't mean anything to someone who doesn't have a rudimentary knowledge of music theory. However, anyone can clearly hear the difference. I personally like this old modal sound a lot, including the full-throated singing style. It has an epic, haunting quality that really appeals to me. But what I think is truly important about this music is that by listening to it, we have an emotional window into the feelings of our cultural ancestors that I think is invaluable and unachievable in any other way. Listen to a sacred harp anthem, one that particularly moves you, and read the Declaration of Independence, or read a speech from that era, or a first-hand account of a battle. It will give you an insight into those people that you could not get any other way. And that is because there is a direct relationship between music making, the emotions, and consciousness. This is a theme I develop further in my Music and Humanity course. But before we move on to the sacred harp and the American Revolution, we have one more interesting item to present. And this emphasizes musically and theologically the larger movement towards cultural inclusion, however limited in many ways. Thomas Comic was a descendant of the Narragansett tribe, who along with other converts to evangelical Christianity during the First Great Awakening, had founded the town of Brothertown in upstate New York. He collected, harmonized, and published an entire book of Indian melodies in the FASOLA tradition. I'll also post a link below to the Yale University project where you can read more about this. We know from first-hand accounts that preachers like James Davenport led blacks, women, and Indians outside the church structures singing into the streets, as well as onto the open fields. Although this movement towards inclusivity was still only taking its first steps, we can see that the Great Awakening is obviously setting a course for the colonies, and with the colonies, the nation that is to come into being in that direction. And now to the sacred harp, the Great Awakening, and the American Revolution. So here's a prime nexus between the sacred harp, or the shape note singing, and the revolution. So there's a spiritual anthem called Chester. And again, as I said, Chester is simply the name of the area. It was written by one of the founders of the sacred harp tradition. Again, it was sacred shape note singing. The itinerant field composer and music teacher, William Billings. So let's just talk a little bit about William Billings. William Billings was born in Boston, Massachusetts. At the age of 14, the death of his father stopped Billings' formal schooling. In order to help his family, young Billings trained as a tanner. He possibly received musical instruction from John Barry, one of the choir members of the New South Church. But for the most part, he was self-taught. Billings had an unusual appearance and a strong addition to snuff. His contemporary wrote that Billings was a singular man of moderate size, short of one leg, with one eye, without any address, and with an uncommon negligence of person. So they're saying he was kind of sloppy, maybe smelled bad, I'm not sure, addicted to snuff. He had only one eye, and one leg was shorter than the other. Still, he spake and sung and thought as a man above the common abilities, unquote. Billings' wife died on March 26, 1795, leaving him with 6 children under the age of 18. He died in poverty in Boston on September 26, 1800. His funeral was announced at the Columbia Sentinel. Died Mr. William Billings, the celebrated music composer. Okay, Chester was probably the most popular war song of the Revolution, yet today it is mentioned only in histories, while Yankee Doodle, its contemporary, lives on. That Yankee Doodle should ever have become a national song is a compliment to the American sense of humor. So let me explain that. During what we, here in America, was called the French and Indian Wars, but it was really part of the Great War of Empire between England and France. And the French and their Native American allies fought the English, the English colonists and their American allies. So that's why it was called the French and Indian Wars. At any rate, so Yankee Doodle, why do we sing that song? The Englishmen, the English officers, used to sing that song. They made it up to make fun of the Americans. They thought their American contemporaries were pretty lackluster soldiers. They're kind of dandies, but they couldn't fight well. And they had kind of a contempt for them. I don't know how deep the contempt was, but enough so that they made a song that made fun of them. So why did we end up playing that song? Well, once the Americans, or the colonials, the colonists at the time, once the revolutionaries started winning the war, especially when the British were retreating, when they had defeated them, and they're running, they started to sing that song and play it as, okay, now what do you think of us Yankee Doodles, Mr. Englishman? So it's kind of a cool story, isn't it? So let's look at the words of Chester. Right? All the sacred harp music, or the shape note music too, is almost exclusively sacred. However, Chester is not. So here are the words. Let tyrants shake their iron rod, and slavery clank her galling chains. We fear them not, we trust in God. New England's God forever reigns. Kind of bombastic. There's a few more verses, but you get the idea, right? Very revolutionary, very bombastic, and that was the main revolutionary song. And it came out of what we now call the sacred harp. Back then was mostly called shape note singing, though some people did call it sacred harp even back then. And Billings, one of the most famous of all the sacred harp itinerant teachers, wrote this song, and he wrote the words. All right, now the American Revolution and the Great Awakening. So the American Revolution started in 1775, ended in 1783. The Great Awakening, somewhere between 1730 and 1755. That the Revolution came somewhat 20 years after the Great Awakening is not surprising and actually makes sense. Cultural down-up changes brought about by the forces of the varieties of the religious experience are, I argue, deep and permanent. Ideologically driven changes, as we have seen throughout the world wherever socialism has managed to establish itself, are ephemeral, require enormous applications of force in order just to maintain themselves in place, and never last beyond a generation or two, unless they move into fascist socialism, such as China. Now, I've discussed that at length already. That deep cultural changes brought about by great religious movements should eventually manifest themselves in a political revolution is not surprising at all. The political is downstream of the cultural, which is downstream of the ecstatic experience. So there is bound to be a time differential between the upheaval of the religious movement and its reverberations in the social political. I'm not going to provide a historical argument, a robust argument here for the historical significance of the American Revolution. I'll simply present a basic outline of my position. One could easily argue, and many have, that the American Revolution was the only truly successful revolution in world history. It provided the first permanent change in self-government, at least, I don't know, for thousands of years. I further argue that the revolution brought about a permanent change in human social political self-organization precisely because the Great Awakening, based in the varieties of the ecstatic experience, generated a deep and permanent change, a decisive shift in the spiritual, emotional, and the very consciousness of the population at large. Throughout all of human history previous to the American Revolution, humanity was ruled by inherited aristocratic and priestly families, and much of humanity continues to be ruled by them to this day. There have always been endless power struggles, but they always resulted only in the replacement of one aristocracy with another, one dominant family with another. But in the end, the fundamental means of government remained the same. But the American Revolution changed that permanently. Why were the changes brought about through the American Revolution so permanent? I would argue because the revolution itself was a result of a far more fundamental change in culture, rooted in the varieties of the ecstatic experience, that is, rooted in the human body itself, in human experience and in human consciousness itself. Why do I say rooted in the body? I will do a presentation on the subject of biogenetic structuralism or neurophenomenology in a video to come. This model is currently the only model we have for how the ecstatic experience is generated within the human body and postulates that all humanity has this potential latent within its own biological structures. Every human being has this potential. I would go so far, and many others have, to say that this phenomenon, the phenomenon of the ecstatic experience, is the most fundamental human characteristic. I said that before. We might be better off called Homo religiosus rather than Homo sapien, as the Homo religiosus produces the Homo sapien. But again, that's also treated in my series, Music and Humanities. Richard Price, a British Unitarian minister, called the American Revolution the most important event in the history of the world since the birth of Christ. At first glance, this seems like a gross overstatement. I might say it is, but nonetheless, the revolution had momentous consequences. It created the United States. It transformed a monarchical society in which the colonists were subjects of the crown into a republic in which they were citizens and participants in the political republic, the political process. The revolution also gave a new political significance to the middling elements of society, artisans, merchants, farmers, and traders, and made it impossible for elites to openly disparage ordinary people. Of course, as we've seen now with the rise of the socialists, the people that represent the people, that has started all over again. The American Revolution elevated the common man to a status equal to that of the former elites. It made aristocracy itself unlawful, by the way. Utterly radical, this alone makes the revolution a momentous historical marker. It succeeded. It still exists, albeit, and I think most of us would agree, it seems to be in deep peril, but for now, it still does exist to one extent or another. The revolution also set into motion the continuing struggle for further human emancipation, while at the same time it provided a stable governmental structure through which those struggles could be successfully prosecuted. For example, the abolition of human slavery, women's suffrage, etc. It continues to be a grand experiment. And all of these movements were precipitated by successive spiritual awakenings. I'm talking about all the movements through the American history. And we'll be pointing this out in the next few videos. During the American Revolution, most congregational ministers sided with the Patriots and American independence. This is largely because the ministers chose to stand with their congregations. In other words, the people were changing, who felt the British government was becoming tyrannical. Ministers preached patriotic sermons on Sundays and during militia musters. In other words, they preached on Sundays, a regular Sunday, but they also went to the militias who were mustering and preached there. Jonathan Mayhew, for example, preached an early revolutionary sermon on the danger of unlimited submission. Many went to war as chaplains, and some actually bore arms in times of extreme danger. Because of their overwhelming support for independence, congregational ministers were called the Black Regiment or Black Robed Regiment by the British. The Great Awakening permanently changed the relationship between the established state-sponsored clergy and the new non-centralized clergy. In other words, pastors went to battle with the layman soldiers. Joseph Galloway, 1731-1803, a former Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly and close friend of Benjamin Franklin, opposed the revolution and fled to England in 1778. Like many Tories, he believed, as he asserted in this pamphlet, a pamphlet that they quoted in the book, that the revolution was, to a considerable extent, a religious quarrel caused by Presbyterians and Congregationalists, whose principles of religion and polity were equally averse to those of the established church and government. Now, what's interesting about this is not the interpretation of a historian. Rather, it's the view of a person who was present at the time, someone who is also a personal friend of one of the architects of the revolution, Benjamin Franklin. So he'd be in a position to realize and point out the extreme position that the religious upheaval had on the revolution. Certainly, the Patriot assemblies were less participatory, democratic, and inclusive than were many evangelical meetings. But one can still see similarities between them, especially in tactics used by Patriot leaders such as Virginia's Patrick Henry, whose "give me liberty or give me death" speech was delivered in the style and language of an evangelist. Wow. They contend that evangelicalism likely spread an egalitarian spirit that helped feed a deep social transformation, a democratic revolution in, quote, hearts and minds, unquote. We've seen that used a lot, accompanying the military and political rebellion. Evangelical piety and temperament shaped the political practices of those who were the most ardent Republicans. Evangelicals also lent widespread credibility to Republican ideology, the faith in human freedom and fear of government corruption that propelled the revolution. Some patriots saw a direct link between Christianity and Republicanism. As Philadelphia physician Benjamin Rush wrote in 1791, Republican forms of government are the best repositories of the Christian gospel. Now, in 1982, however, historian John Butler argued that the Great Awakening was an interpretive fiction invented by 19th century evangelicals. According to Butler, the so-called Great Awakening had been limited in scope and had almost no lasting effects. There really wasn't anything great about it. Now consider, this was never claimed by any historian until 1982. So what's happening in our universities in 1982? I mean, really, need I say more? So regardless of to what degree we assign the role of the religion in the American Revolution, the separation of church and state, as specifically stated in our Constitution, was never intended as a device through which to marginalize Christianity from the public square. The opposite. It was intended to prohibit any government, federal or state, from establishing a monopoly of Christian thought, as was the case with the Anglican Church, and was still, to a considerable extent, by a lot of the Congregationalist churches. The separation of church and state was to allow for the proliferation of Christian thought to have a public voice in and out of the government, not to marginalize or eliminate the proliferation of Christian thought and morals, far from it. It was a way to guarantee it, but also free to influence the government at all levels, not through legislation, but through moral commitment. Cultural Marxism has now generated a completely new interpretation of the separation of church and state. It is an attempt to drive Christianity from the public and political spheres, the opposite of what was intended by the Constitution's separation of church and state. Again, the separation of church and state was intended to allow Christian thought to proliferate and integrate into every social sector freely and without government restriction or control. But an undeniable parallel to the separation of church and state was the parallel questioning of the relationship between the King of England, who was the head of the established church, as we just said, in the colonies, and the relationship between the colonies and the King of England's government. A political revolution could not avoid also being a religious revolution in the face of the simple fact that the King of England was also the head of the Anglican Church. You could hardly revolt against the king's government and not be in revolt against the king's church. How could you remain a political subject of the king's government and still remain subject of the king's church? The dilemma is obvious. So a kind of succinct summary is decentralized religion or culture led to decentralized government, not the other way around. After the Revolution, evangelical Christianity would continue to thrive despite Thomas Jefferson's confident prediction that all Americans would soon become what he called liberal Unitarians like himself. Unitarians denied the doctrine of the Trinity and emphasized Jesus' moral teachings over traditional Christian doctrines. But much to the contrary, evangelicism exploded. I'll have a lot more to say on this mistake that Jefferson made regarding the ecstatic experience versus Enlightenment logic in didactic morality. It's a direct analogy of the same problem Nietzsche identified in regards to the Dionysian experience and the rising Greece of the Socratic Platonic didactic moralizing logic that, to his way of thinking, Nietzsche polluted the tradition of Greek tragedy. We're going to do an interesting video on that, so I'll get back to that later. Now, to this day, all American evangelicism has their roots in the First Great Awakening. The American Revolution was most definitely a product of, or at the very least, a parallel with the First Great Awakening. I would also argue that since the Revolution was built upon a permanent and solid cultural change, the results of the Revolution have also been permanent. Again, it's 200 years. Maybe permanent is too strong a word. Congregational proliferation is an expression of ritual proliferation, structured behaviors in relation to the sacred. This is something I'll develop more thoroughly when I introduce my model of culture, the ritual spiral. From these into the forest, ecstatic experience, emerge representations that generate new rituals as structured behaviors, new artistic expressions, new music, new intellectual explorations, and new organizational institutions of higher learning, and new and ever-proliferating congregations. This proliferation of congregations and denominations continues to this very day. The institutionalized churches were forced to make room for the proliferation of new religious institutions, new churches, new rituals, new ways of thinking about the relationship between the individual, the community, and the divine. A new, what I call, knowledge of the self that characterizes the ecstatic experience. The self to the self to the community, the self to the operational environment. In this case, I would extend that to meaning New England, the New World, and the self to the cosmological or the divine. Again, these are themes that I'll be developing in my ritual spiral. And the most important, the profound fundamental, is the cosmological to the divine. All the others find their relation from that relation. The separation with the Church of England, and with that separation, the logical conclusion of a separation with the King of England, who was, as I've said many times now, the head of the Church of England, the Anglican Church, that was the dominant spiritual guide of the colonies. This cannot be argued to have been unrelated. I mean, that's impossible. The Awakening movement was followed by intellectual and academic debate. Masonry and Enlightenment rationality balanced the ecstatic inspiration, born again in the Holy Spirit, gave rise to new academic institutions, as I've said, new traditions, and new institutions of higher learning. The search for truth as a bottom-up process, and I mean, bottom-up is also the divine going up to the institutions, right? The ecstatic experience. The search for truth as a bottom-up process. New schools of divinity came into being and new universities. Princeton, Rutgers, Brown, Dartmouth, all of these were results of the First and Second Great Awakenings. The merging of more sober, rational thought following the initial ecstatic inspirational experience. This can be seen as an analog to Nietzsche's Dionysian Apollonian dialectic that is generated by what Nietzsche called the Dionysian procession into the forest to experience the paradox that lies at the heart of existence, or a deeper experience of reality. Music is, according to Nietzsche, the Dionysian art. This natural process is powerfully demonstrated in the rise of the sacred harp tradition that emerged during the very same period. A new music for a new spirituality, a new ecstatic experience. Itinerant congregational sacred music teachers, a musical parallel component to the itinerant preachers, who are not degree graduates from the universities, neither one. New music proliferation generates new emotional nuances. I'll be talking a lot about this in videos to come. This generates new states of consciousness, and with that, new intellectual nuances. Emotions and consciousness cannot be separated. I previously pointed to the recent neurological studies in the relationship between the emotions and consciousness, and I'll be doing a video that really focuses on that. There is no intellectual thinker operating within an emotional vacuum. It's really critical to understand that. Emotions are actually embodied strategies. But more on that later. A new bottom-up musical cultural movement intertwined with the revolutionary political movement. Obvious parallels between the Great Awakening and the American Revolution. So, each individual was capable of pursuing their own paths towards salvation without restriction by an organized state-sponsored church. Each individual was capable of formulating a vision of his, her own destiny, and should be free to pursue that destiny without government interference or assistance, the right to pursue and the right to fail, in the pursuit of one's own personal destiny, the pursuit of happiness, the right to risk eternal damnation, following one's own vision of eternal salvation. We cannot separate the pursuit of a personal salvation, a personal relationship with the divine, without interference from an established church, from the pursuit of a personal destiny without interference and restrictions from a government. These two sides of the same coin are exactly personified in the King of England, the head of the established government and at once the head of the established church. Disestablishment. This became a very kind of a catchword, a word that was very prominent and popular and used a lot in a lot of the speeches. The two, the Revolution and the Great Awakening, I argue, were inseparable. And by the way, did I mention that the universities should be defunded and that cultural Marxism should be driven out of the universities' thought?